Whether black men admit it or not, they feel light-skinned women are more attractive than dark-skinned, and they'd rather see long hair than a short afro because that's closer to white women. That comes from being inundated with media from the time you're born that constantly fed you the white woman as the image of beauty. That's both conscious and unconscious, said Mr. Lee. But on the whole, talking to my friends and knowing men, I see that a premium is put on light-skinned sisters with long hair.
Don't nobody know my trouble but God.
I'm GSO. Hello. As we've seen throughout this series, race is a construct that is used for the benefits of some and the marginalization and justification of the oppression of others. It has no basis in any field of science and was from the start intended to determine the treatment, perception, and rights or lack thereof of groups of people who phenotypically or geographically differed from the groups of those who invented the concept in the first place, who called themselves the so-called white race. One cannot fight racism without abolishing the very concepts of race, and those who deny this fact often do so due to the benefits they enjoy from these classifications existing in society and in the law. Now, because the concept of race is a social construct, it allows people to be flexible with different classifications to gain certain privileges or benefits or to avoid certain ills whenever convenient. Examples of this are when people who are actively being openly racist against a group will claim that they have an ancestor or a relative or a parent from that group to try to absolve them of the blatancy of the fact that they're being racist.
The fact that that journalist had no idea how to define diversity, equity, and inclusion might even point to the idea that she is a DEI hire herself, and that's coming from a biracial woman. So are you guys going to call me a racist as well and say I'm utilizing the new N-word? I guess that must be what I am, a half-black racist who is using the N-word hard R.
Or when people try to appeal to or gain the trust of a certain group by claiming that they have an ancestor or parent of that group.
California's Attorney General Kamala Harris scripted history as she won U.S. Senate seat from the state, becoming the first Indian American to reach the feat.
California's Kamala Harris is the first Indian American U.S. Senator.
I stand before you as the first candidate for Vice President of the United States of South Asian descent. Growing up, my mother would take my sister, Maya, and me back to what was then called Madras. Because she wanted us to understand where she had come from and where we had ancestry.
Do you support reparations for black people?
Well, listen, again. The reality also is this. Any policy that will benefit black people will benefit all of society. Let's be clear about that. Let's really be clear about that. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No.
Or when people try to gain sympathy by claiming the same.
If I did this, then it means that I stuck my fist in the fears of black Americans in this country for over 400 years.
What the hell is he talking about? He ain't black.
If we did not have racialized societies, and race was not so important to people in society or different communities, then these sorts of opportunistic tactics would not work, as one's race would not be used to gain appeal to people, or gain privileges or sympathy or whatever. However, in countries or racialized societies where injustices and atrocities have been and are still committed on the basis of this concept of race, it is difficult to exclude it as a factor in different situations and circumstances. By racialized societies, I mean societies wherein race is considered significant in some way, either in society or by law. Therefore, with this understanding in mind, in this 8th part of the series on the contemporary condition of so-called black people around the world, I will detail the elusive manner by which some people use the black identity to obtain benefits or a certain perception or acceptance, while if we are to be consistent or even simply realistic, they should not qualify as black based on the standard that is applied to other groups of people. I'll detail how this practice of opting in and out of the black identity or blackness ambiguates or obfuscates the actual reality of the experience of actual black people who are not able to do this in society, as well as how it misrepresents and obfuscates the identities of historical figures and events, which will in turn paint an inaccurate picture of the reality in certain parts of black history. and how this ambiguity in the black identity perpetuates and will continue to perpetuate problems in racialized societies today and in the future. It is important to begin with the fact that most of the world, with the exceptions of Nazi Germany, the State of Israel, apartheid South Africa, and perhaps India if you replace race with caste, does not or did not have racial laws as stringent and as heavily enforced as the United States of America, which will be the focus of much of this discussion. Denazification officially began in Germany in August 1945. Apartheid officially ended in South Africa between 1990 and 1991. Israel is still as evil, if not more evil than before, and India still has a caste system, despite denials. The United States Civil Rights Act that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, and national origin was proposed by President Kennedy in 1963, opposed by the still very racist U.S. Senate, but then squeezed through by LBJ in 1964. The legacy of America's Jim Crow history has never ceased to linger in American society. But while the history of the hate and oppression from white Americans against black Americans is well known and understood by most, the, at times, even greater and more zealous intense hate from mixed-race Americans against black Americans is lesser known. But it should be in order to understand racial issues as they exist today, particularly with respect to the type of oppression and persecution that black Americans face from different groups.
I'm tired of all these monkey-looking dark butts coming for my pretty self. Child, don't take your insecurities out on me. Girls are mad because they couldn't pass the brown paper bag test. Yep, I said it.
Listen, black women, at the end of the day, I would rather take one of these lames as opposed to, one of these gangster thugs. I'm just confused as to why a lot of you black women pick the same men. Look at these nice, light-skinned, I don't know if they're all biracial, who cares? Look at them. Look how friendly they look, and look how nice they look. Okay, they don't look angry. They don't look super aggressive. They don't look like they're going to knock your head off. They look like normal black men to me, right? But a lot of you black women don't want to date light-skinned men, and I know why. It's because black men told you not to. I've dated a lot of light-skinned guys. I've never met one that's soft. I have never, okay? But look at these thugs right here. Look at these thugs. Just gangsters, just thugs, disgusting black men, angry and violent, disgusting gangsters. Stop dating them. Ew, look how filthy they look. Look angry. Ew, doing drugs, going to prison, losers. Leave these Pookies and Tyrones alone because they're all gangster thugs. Leave them alone, black women.
Let me not be insecure to you, sister. Let me not try to break it down to you. But have you understand I'm a light-skinned woman? So I benefit from colorism. You're a dark-skinned woman, sister. You can never make it to the heights I make it from.
The United States is the only nation in the world to legally codify and implement what's known as the one-drop rule in a number of its states. This law would completely and solely classify an individual into the racial categorization of black on the basis of having even one African ancestor. This therefore forced biracial or multiracial individuals to be absorbed into the classification and community of what we could call monoracial or unambiguous black people, and thereby preventing the creation of a biracial American identity and a possible biracial community. Such a biracial identity exists in basically all other parts of the world, with perhaps the exception of some Caribbean nations, where many appear to have socially adopted the one-drop rule as well. Now, there are, of course, other systems of classifying people as one thing and not the other, such as patrilineal cultures, such as Arabs or many African tribes, whereby the child is classified or identified as the ethnicity of the father, or matrilineal cultures, such as Jewish people, where the same applies but in respect to the mother. In South Africa, for example, there are the Cape Coloreds, or simply Coloreds, who are individuals with mixed ancestry. Interracial marriages in South Africa are significantly uncommon, and so very often when a person is racially mixed in South Africa, it is often because they are the product of two colored people, and very seldom due to the parents being of two different races. Coloreds have developed their own culture, communities, and even dialects and lingos that are recognized by other groups in the country without contestation. Therefore, unless a colored has grown up in a predominantly so-called black community or culture like Sotho, Xhosa, Zulu, Ndebele, Swati, Tonga, Tswana, Venda, or whatever, they will not identify as black because they are very well aware that it is not the same classification. Being mixed and being anything else are two different classifications. If a person, however, has grown up in such a so-called black community, they will very often refer to the culture they belong to rather than their race. And indeed, many such mixed people do exist in South Africa. This is in fact the same in all African countries, whereby race is not usually mentioned, but rather the tribe or the culture of the individual. This is partially due to the redundancy of mentioning that one is black in a society where practically everyone is black, but also because one's ethnicity, tribe, culture, or language is of far greater relevance and importance to continental Africans, and so very often biracial people who have a parent or recent ancestor who is visibly not sub-Saharan African will be fully accepted into either their patrilineal or matrilineal culture or tribe. It varies from tribe to tribe. And of course, there is also the element of one's nationality. And so, if a person is visibly mixed, the unambiguous African will simply focus on the mixed person's nationality, rather than their ethnicity or culture or tribe. In fact, arguably the most significant and valued characteristic of a person to sub-Saharan African people is the language they speak. It is primarily language that both unites and unfortunately divides Africans. Notwithstanding, there are other sources of unity and division among them. So regarding multiracial or biracial Africans, since it is often the case or presumed to be the case that multiracial folk are not aware or do not have much to do with their African side, people simply accept them by their nationality, such as Nigerian, Nigerian, Burkinabe, Congolese, Cameroonian, Beninese, Ghanaian, Angolan, etc. However, multiracial Africans are a minority in all African countries, including Southern African countries, where the population of those of European and multiracial ancestry is larger, but still a minority. It is important to note that there is generally a wealth gap between monoracial Africans and multiracial Africans in most African countries, often due to multiracial folk inheriting family wealth from their European side. As we will soon see, this is also very much the case in the United States, and is for the same reasons, namely that some of the colonial European parents of these multiracial children bestowed benefits such as career opportunities, education, and financial wealth onto them, and this generational wealth continued till this very day. Colonial racial discrimination and persecution tended to also be relaxed for many mixed-race individuals as compared to the indigenous population. Cape Colours in South Africa are a bit of an exception. There were initially 3 classifications in apartheid South Africa: white, black, and colored. White people were defined as one born of 2 white parents and who possessed the quote-unquote habits, speech, education, deportment, and demeanor of a white person, whatever the hell that meant. Black people were defined as belonging to an African race or tribe, and while the black and white racial classifications defined by positive or active attributes, coloreds were defined as the negative of these two, in the sense that they were initially those who did not fully qualify as either black or white. This is why Asians, particularly Indians, were initially classified as coloreds until they later received their own classification of Asian. Now, some colors could actually be reclassified to be classified as either fully black or fully white if they passed certain very strange tests that were straight up pulled right out of the air to be quick and of low effort. Visual features that were generally distinct between groups were compared, distinctions that people may still notice today, like, well, has. And no, I'm not joking. As part of the Population Registration Act of 1950, one of the ways of determining which side a colored person fell was to compare the shape of the buttocks. If it was found that there was, well, basically nothing there, then I think we all know which side they'd fall under for that one. And if they were rounder or more voluptuous, they'd of course be considered African. Jaw lines and hair were also compared. Hair was interesting as there was something called the pencil test, by which a pencil would be put in one's hair. If the pencil got stuck as they tried to pull it out, you were black, and if it passed through, you were white. There were literally siblings and people of the same family who were classified into different racial categories, despite having the same parents or lineage. Many people who later down in their generations who today would be considered white were once colored, including people like F.W. de Klerk. Now, as with other African nations, mixed-race people received better treatment than those classified as black. Coloreds received a better education than the black population, even though it was admittedly still inferior to the white population. Other examples include the fact that coloreds and Asians were given voting rights long before the black population. Some colors, with enough, I suppose, hair gel and makeup, could even pass for whites in society, just as in the US under Jim Crow. Today, the colored population still has a higher average income than the black population, but the gap has narrowed over the years due to an increase in drug abuse, crime, high teenage pregnancy levels, family dysfunction, gang violence, unemployment, apathy, mental illness, and an elevated school dropout rate in their communities. Generally, South African coloreds accept and embrace their identity as coloreds, and so it is much clearer and observable to identify racism and prejudice between communities due to the acceptance of the distinction between coloreds and other groups. And indeed, there is some clear racism that some coloreds have towards black people, sometimes even using the same racial slurs that white South Africans use against black South Africans. This distinction between blacks and coloreds, however, is not even remotely the case with the United States, which I will now return to discussing. Different states at different times in the US varied regarding how far back they would go when taking into account the race of an individual in terms of their ancestry, especially due to the fact that many who were classified as white were aware of their African ancestry. African ancestry is sometimes as close as 2 or 3 generations prior, and so if the one-drop rule was to be applied so stringently, they would therefore end up disqualifying themselves from being white. This one-drop rule in fact became a reason as to why black Americans were able to grow in numbers and therefore grow in opposition to draconian American laws in the span of time that they did. Because before the implementation of such laws, one's racial classification was subjectively assumed based on one's physical outward appearance, particularly their phenotypic features such as complexion and hair texture. Due to the widespread procreation between what for the purposes of this video I will call unambiguous black people, by which I mean black people with features that are typically attributed to sub-Saharan Africans without apparent ambiguity of mixture with people who are not sub-Saharan African. To understand this, it is important to understand hypo and hyper descent. Hypo descent is the practice of classifying mixed-race people, or people of mixed ethnicities, into a subordinate racial group in a racialized society. The one-drop rule is such a hypodescent rule that is applied strictly regarding people of African ancestry. This is in part due to the United States government's obsession with race, especially with black people in particular, and the ripple effect it has on the rest of the world's perception of the concept of race. But it is also due to the unique features generally attributed to sub-Saharan African ethnicities, including black or brown skin, and very curly or kinky dark hair. And such features tend to present themselves in one way or another more distinctly than other groups who have more phenotypically similar skin complexion and hair textures, with perhaps the exception of the shape of the eyes of certain Asian ethnicities. All this to say that the discrimination and prejudice directed towards black people in particular, coupled with the distinct features of most sub-Saharan Africans, there has historically existed an incentive for people of all groups to distance themselves from blackness in terms of racial classifications and gravitate towards whiteness to obtain the benefits in terms of racial classifications. However, as times and situations change, there have also been benefits to be obtained by pandering, passing, appropriating, claiming, or latching onto the black racial identity in a way that would not even be remotely socially or legally acceptable with other groups. I will explain this in detail, but first here's a short and rather ugly history of bi- and multiracialism in the United States that many tend to ignore or simply do not know about. When one carefully explores black American history, one will quickly begin to notice a tendency in what kind of people classified as black tended to have more means, education, and opportunities than other black people, biracial people, referring to those with African ancestry, of course. Now, often today, when black Americans have conversations about colorism, sometimes those of a more naive position tend to try to shut down criticism of biracial people by trying to coerce everyone to have sympathy for biracial folk in the black American community due to their literal origins in the antebellum era. You've probably heard it a million times that they were born out of the rape of their black mothers by their white slave owners and treated as property by their own fathers, or never claimed and did not know where to fit in. This narrative, while true, is repeated so often that it overshadows the more sinister aspects of biracial history that still continues today in American society. We rarely hear of the biracial children who are given advantages above the monoracial African slaves, the ones whose white slave owner fathers gave them an opportunity for respectable careers, education, and allowed them to sleep inside the house, and so on. This imbalance in narrative is due to a number of reasons that we will go into, but let's begin with the fact that there is a preference in Hollywood, the music industry, and most of American media really, to represent black Americans with Americans who are in fact biracial. And to be more accurate, this biased representation tends to be with regards to women more than with men. Whereas you can probably have a good list of a number of dark-skinned or unambiguous appearing black men in American media, but the same cannot be said for unambiguous or dark-skinned black women, despite there being no shortage of such women who should qualify. Instead, there's a tendency to choose a few token dark-skinned women who fit the description and give the impression or subtly imply that this is quote-unquote the best that unambiguous or dark-skinned black women have to offer. Now, of course, there are other factors that come into play, especially in Hollywood, such as how producers are generally very skeptical and reluctant to launch new actors, even when there are talented actors just waiting for the opportunity, because they would rather play it safe with a familiar or beloved face that will get people to come see the movie. It's even more difficult in the music industry. But this excuse, really, does not completely explain the whole picture of this bias in mostly depicting ambiguous-looking women in media.
Oh yeah, I don't like no weedish. Can help me and just leave quick. Oh no, you pick up with a boss, no worries at all. I can give you everything.
Your future bright, shorty, your future bright.
The music was bright.
Smartest move of my life.
Oh, bravo. That was fun.
Sign her up, Double D!
Sign her up? Nas single-handedly annihilated all that is music.
Yeah.
Boy, you can have my heart and all my love. I give you back cause I ain't too quick to judge. And I don't need nobody telling me that this ain't love, it's direct jealousy. So maybe we should run away. Run away.
That wasn't the best platform for your voice.
Nope.
You have a unique voice. And Brit did sound better than yours.
That was a bullshit call!
Ultimately, this bias against black women in particular, in both media and everyday society, results in a situation wherein ambiguous men and women are accepted, black men are accepted, but black women are not, making them the one demographic in the so-called black community, to be consistently perceived more negatively than the others, and even by the others. So why are black, unambiguous, or dark-skinned men accepted and black women are not? Because black American men have a tendency to actively form relationships with basically everyone else in the entire human population except for black women. Many are even willing to form relationships with non-black women that they do not even find attractive, but by virtue of them simply being Latina or European or Asian or mixed, they somehow automatically consider them a better option. This is due to 1. Seeing women in general as trophies and something to show off to others, and 2. A serious case of internalized racism, resentment, and colorism towards others who look like them, and absolute self-hatred for themselves, particularly due to centuries of conditioning and the destruction of their self-esteem, and of course due to America's obsession with race and how they attribute any failures or negative position in society as being a result of their so-called race. Thus, the ones with a low self-esteem begin to resent their own race due to their self-perception, which in fact results from the perception that others have of them. And as I've explained previously, if one hates oneself, they'll hate others similar to themselves.
Let's read off some colorist things celebrity black men have said. I don't want no black bitch, I'm already black. Light-skinned woman more sensitive, they too tough. Retweeted that same Kodak quote. My daughter a dark-skinned billionaire, that's the difference between her and you. Beautiful black woman, I bet that bitch look better red. Light-skinned women usually have better credit than dark-skinned women, broke-ass dark hoes. Only wanna fuck black bitches with the nice hair. Let's not forget his no dark skins allowed club rule. All the prettiest kids is light skinned anyway, normally. With the red lipstick thing, I gotta be real, you gotta be fair skinned to get away with that. We got some pretty light skinned daughters we gotta raise. We in trouble, my nigga. Nigga can't stand no black ass bitch.
Oh no. Well, yeah, I ain't gonna lie, I know I'm ugly too.
You think you're ugly?
Little piece. I still get hoed.
Are you in? Remember there was the whole Kodak thing about how he prefers light skinned girls? Because
I broke up with
he was saying how light skinned girls are easier to control, I guess. Something like that. Are you on that?
I ain't gonna lie. What he say? I'm already black, I don't need no black bitch.
Right, that's what he said.
So yeah, I ain't gonna lie. I can't have no cut like I know if I'm fucking with you, I'm black as fuck, right? I'm black as shit.
Yeah, black is beautiful though, man.
So I know if I fuck with a black baby, we gonna have a black ass baby.
So?
I ain't with that.
Why?
Cause I'm already black as fuck.
So?
I can't. No.
Why? I mean, this is an interesting thing. You know what I mean? Like, so if you have a baby, you don't want your baby to be the same complexion as you? Why?
This a once in a lifetime thing.
What do you mean?
Like, this a dark ass shade. They be hell nah. I can't have
straight up.
Better than race.
But you're saying that you don't want a kid that's gonna be your complexion. But don't you want your kid to look like you though?
This unfortunately leaves many unambiguous black women in an isolated, uncomfortable situation, especially for those black women who are actively trying to form a stronger black community and fix problems in their communities. Their efforts tend to go to waste as they are forced to work with a large population of black men who do not desire them for anything more than a financial or emotional crutch or for sex. Of course, as you know, this is not the case with all black Americans, as there are plenty of happy, healthy relationships between black American men and women. But this problem is enough to be a problem that contributes to the numerous failed marriages and single parenthood among the black American population. Consider something interesting. Because of the self-hatred among black American men, those that do have children do not wish to have children who look like them. And so despite them still using black women for sex, often resulting in unintended pregnancies, they have no problem having mixed race or ambiguous looking children. But that simply means that if black women start to do the same, then it will lead to a great reduction of unambiguous or dark-skinned black children. And this is exactly what has been happening for centuries, and thus why there is such admixture among black Americans. It is because primarily black men chose, or had a preference, as they would say, for people who look different and lighter than them. In the grand scheme of things, race is unimportant, but hatred, discrimination, and prejudice are. And it is at least worth taking these realities into account if anyone would wish to resolve issues in the black American community. There are, of course, incredibly serious issues among black American women as well that prevent them from forming healthy, positive relationships, such as bad attitudes, irresponsibility, and pretty much any problem that one finds with black men. The solution, however, is for healthy communication of these issues among both black men and women to occur in order to resolve the issues in their community. And it would appear that these discussions are being had, but they are being had in isolation, with various online communities in what is now collectively known as the manosphere, wherein black men have conversations among themselves in an echo chamber about the perception they have of themselves, the perception they have of black women, and the perception they have of members of other groups.
We talk about white women. Your image is beneath them. White women do it too. You ain't on that level. You don't have the, oh, I wasn't supposed to say that.
Every problem I ever had came from the black woman because I believed in them and they came up short.
Black women have the lowest approval rate of all the other races of women. I'm gonna say that again.
That's probably how we met his wife. And then she looked back at him like,
bro, if you want to date a bunch of Shaniquas, go for it, man.
LaQuisha?
Yeah, like me and Fresh aren't really down with the brown like that.
Man.
We ain't night riders.
I don't really date black girls. It's not because like most black girls are like annoying, how to put this, ratchet, and they don't know how to like be reserved.
Black women have formed their online communities as well, wherein they discuss their grievances. But unfortunately, due to the lack of communication between the two groups, it results in little to no positive changes for either of them, and ultimately a worsening of the community at large. When one compares the two communities, however, one may realize that there appears to be more willingness for discussions on positive changes among women rather than men, because generally there's more oppression by men against women than the other way around, and unfortunately that is the case across demographics and borders. Misrepresentation, a heavy byproduct of the one-drop rule in America. The misrepresentation of black experiences, history, perception, and facts. To help you understand, consider this. For those of you who understand the South African social and racial context, imagine for a moment you have a colored South African being labeled and presented as a black South African to billions of people all around the world, leading many people to believe that that is what black South Africans typically look like, sound like, and such. I doubt that many, if any, black South Africans would accept that. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that some are willing to let it slide for the first time. I'm sure people will forget about it. Now imagine that the same thing happens again and again and again with a number of colored South Africans always being presented as black South Africans, and therefore being representation of black South Africans to other people. Ultimately, whether black South Africans accept it or not, it will not change the fact that black South Africans are being misrepresented. Being colored is not the same classification as being black in the South African context. Therefore, to constantly depict or understand colored as black is a misrepresentation. And this may not seem like such an issue at first, but in a racialized society or world, this has some serious implications. Consider, for example, that if coloreds are represented as black, then if there's an income gap or a tendency to hire specifically colored people, then on paper it will appear as though there is no such income or hiring gap, because on paper, coloreds and blacks are one and the same. But in reality and in society, their lived experiences and treatment from others are very different. Now consider that this is what has been happening with African Americans literally since white men started fathering biracial children from the mass rape of enslaved African women centuries ago. Historians estimate that around 58% of African slave women had experienced rape at the hands of white slave owners and other white men during the antebellum era, and with time, these children grew up to form their own sorts of social class between whites and blacks, especially in the South. This sort of in-between racial class gave an illusion and impression of social progress because most of these mixed children were classified as black when they were not. They were not fully sub-Saharan African. They were mixed, and this was the only proximity to blackness that the white supremacist system was willing to allow to have some rights. This sort of misrepresentation and tokenism exists till today. And this ongoing misrepresentation of actual black people prevents everyone, including black people themselves, from being able to see the prejudice that is happening to them from mixed-race people. It is important to understand that at that time, and even today, there are many mixed-race people who are classified as black under the American legal system, but do not see themselves as black. But those who do not understand or accept this reality, in other words, those who still believe in or apply the one-drop rule, tend to understand the prejudice that mixed-race people have against black people as isolated cases, when in fact this sort of prejudice should be considered at the same level as though it were a white person, because they are not part of the same racial classification, or at least they shouldn't be, considering that they are not one or the other of their parents. They are a mixture of two racial classifications. Now consider these examples to understand my point. We often speak of black slave owners and somehow have an image of monoracial black people owning other monoracial black people in America. But this is not the case at all. The vast majority of the 3,775 so-called black slave owners were in fact mixed-race people, and usually quite wealthy due to the opportunities and financial wealth given or bestowed upon them by their white fathers. This was in fact the in-between third racial class that I referred to a moment ago. The majority of these mixed-race slave owners were in Louisiana, Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina, and some of these mixed-race slave owners unsurprisingly offered to fight on the Confederate side during the Civil War, for obvious reasons, to continue being able to own slaves, and also in order to uphold the distinction and separation between themselves and actual black people, in the fear that they may also be considered and classified as black and receive the same treatment. A statewide study of black slaveholders was conducted in 1985 in South Carolina, and it found that 80% of the so-called black slave owners were in fact mixed race, but nearly 90% of them were classified as black. And it was in fact quite common for free slaves to become slave owners themselves and try to get closer to whiteness to make it ahead in life. This mentality of distancing oneself from blackness as much as possible came from the fear of the sorts of fates that awaited a person classified as black. Those who were so-called high yellow enough to pass for white very often did so as best as they could, despite the risk of being lynched or otherwise murdered should a white mob find out their true lineage. Now, as time passed, white society became increasingly aware of the practice of racial passing. So politicians and white society at large began trying to find ways to prevent passing by defining exactly who qualified as a white person in America. Because here's the thing about white people when they conceptualize race. White people, who obviously benefit the most from the concept of race and colorism, ensure that the line between what is considered white and what is not remain well defined and solid in order to ensure their continued privilege and their position at the top of the racial hierarchy that we discussed previously. Because if anyone can be considered white, then nobody in essence is white, and therefore nobody is to be treated better or worse than anyone else on the basis of their ancestry, color, ethnicity, geographical origin, language, and all the other arbitrary factors that make up the concept of race. If people could simply wake up and realize this reality, we will then have taken the greatest step towards a fairer and less prejudicial world. And so in reality, it's not a matter of white people being afraid of not being white anymore. It's that privilege or advantages only exist if there's a group that is underprivileged or disadvantaged. It is very important to understand this, that the one thing that any privileged group oftentimes fears the absolute most is not that the other groups will attack them or rise up against them, not necessarily. It's that other groups will begin to receive equal treatment as them in society. It is that they become viewed as the same as people who they in their minds consider inferior. It is to live in a world where they are equal to everyone else, because from their position, they see this equality as them coming down rather than other people rising up.
And we've known about DEI for a long time. We've been talking about it and criticizing it for quite some time, while the left has been pedestalizing it and talking about how it's such a wonderful practice and it's going to even the playing field for all marginalized identities and bring fairness and equity to our new world. We're no longer leveling the playing field. We're giving certain groups of people a leg up and pushing the others down.
This is why you may have heard the statements that the concept of race itself is racist. It is a classification system to place human beings into a hierarchy. Now, what I've just explained in regards to white people is exactly the case with many biracial people throughout US history against black people. Biracial people had to overzealously prove that they were not black and deny their blackness in order to avoid receiving the same treatment as black people. Often this was done by oppressing blacks in a sort of rather be the bully than be bullied motif, which, by the way, I've discussed this sort of reasoning in detail in part 6 of the series. This racial gatekeeping that white people do is applied by other groups of people to their own concepts of race for the same reason, to protect their status and standing in society. And they do this by pushing forward their definition and description of what their so-called race is. And this can only be done effectively by representation. Regarding representation, it brings up thoughts about what sorts of African Americans tend to be used to represent the African American community or racial group, especially to other parts of the world. For decades, Black American representation has had a rather interesting history in terms of what they were widely known for. And practically since the 80s, white corporate executives have been promoting and pushing certain black celebrities with certain ideas and influences onto the public, and this has contributed to the attitudes and behavior of particularly the younger generations of Black Americans. But besides that aspect, especially with regards to women, there has also been a preference or tendency to use mixed race women as a representation or depiction of black women. Dark-skinned, unambiguous, or monoracial black women tend to be sidelined or tokenized with a small selection. This therefore gives the impression that this is the best that dark-skinned, unambiguous, or monoracial black women have to offer. And that is not true. They are simply being sidelined or ignored. And unfortunately, this problem is not simply being done by white Americans. The sad reality is that this practice is most heavily and overzealously upheld and perpetuated by Black American men. Now, of course, Black Americans are not the only ones who have problems in terms of a bias in the representation of their group. Currently, it is quite complicated with the so-called South American Latinos, as they often have a serious tribal and colorist problem of their own regarding indigenous South Americans and South Americans of African descent compared to South Americans of European or Asian descent or ancestry.
Sad, but it's the truth. I've heard it many, many times, and we are treated differently. A lot of Latinos don't want my kind mixed into their family because they didn't want to better the race. And better the race means more European features.
And while that issue is quite similar to the problem at hand, it is not quite the same and requires its own separate discussion. And so all of this begs the question of why Black Americans do not define and preserve their racial identity as other groups have done and continue to do. The answer, in fact, lies in the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule was an attempt from white people to define and preserve whiteness, particularly against those of sub-Saharan African descent. Having quote-unquote one drop of African blood is such a loose definition that it makes it very difficult for people to define, especially when it is being defined for the people. The one-drop rule was specifically intended to prevent black people from benefiting from the many privileges and laws in favor of those classified as white. Because remember, as I mentioned before, people were able to pass as white despite being of mixed ancestry. When white people caught wind of this practice, the one-drop rule became a solution to gatekeep the so-called white racial classification. And so in so applying this rule, biracial people were affected as well. And this rule placed many biracial black folk into the same boat as monoracial black folk. The one-drop rule would settle the question of which side of the black and white fence biracial people fell under for once and for all. And interestingly, it is mostly because of this that some semblance of unity either formed or became clearer between monoracial blacks and biracial blacks, because now it was official that biracial black folk were legally to suffer under the same fate as monoracial blacks, no matter how yellow or pale their skin was. No matter how much makeup they applied, or how much they kissed up to white folk, or how much they oppressed other black folk, biracial people with a sub-Saharan African ancestor were to suffer the same discrimination that dictated where they could live, what jobs they could have, what institutions such as schools, hospitals, and so on they could attend or go to, what facilities they could use, who they could marry, and most significantly, they were not allowed to vote or hold political positions. Before the one-drop rule, people mostly went by appearance, in that if you looked white, you were white, and absorbed into the white majority population, and considering the fate of being black during those times, no one wanted to be classified as black, and so every effort was made to look as European as possible. But after the one-drop rule, biracial black folk began to marry more among monoracial black people because they were prevented from marrying whites due to so-called miscegenation laws. Now, some more optimistic people try to preserve their so-called faith in humanity by noting that the thoughts that these laws were debated by representatives and lawmakers in different states, and the fact that some representatives were actually opposed to enacting those laws, means that the world wasn't as racist as one may think. Well, don't get your hopes up, because most of the opposition was not at all for the reasons one may think. You may be surprised to know that the representatives who voted against enacting a complete one-drop rule, which would classify anyone with any African ancestry as black, did so due to them being aware of their own African ancestry. They even knew the names of those African ancestors. And so, trying to enact such a rule would therefore disqualify themselves from even being representatives to begin with. So, racism is so stupid. This is similar to how people become heartened at the thought of slavery ending, attributing it to the good hearts of mankind. While there were certainly individuals who opposed slavery out of principle or empathy for their fellow man, the institution of slavery ultimately ended for economic reasons and the fact that it was no longer profitable to own slaves. Also, at least in America, there was literally a war fought over it, so there's that too. And even the guy who started that war did not initially do so for the purpose of freeing slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation came as a consequence of an ultimatum that Lincoln gave to the Confederacy, and was more of an added bonus rather than the end-all be-all of the war. So regarding that one-drop rule, it therefore came down to the question of how far does your ancestry go before someone had a child with a black person, and for many representatives, they would only end up hurting their own rights if such a rule was applied. An example of this is the case of the Melungians, who were multiracial families of mostly European and African ancestry who tended to marry people classified as white, and so eventually, whatever non-white traits they had have long since faded away. In fact, till this day, there are white supremacists who believe they are even superior to the regular supremacists, people who try to trace their ancestry to the Confederacy or even to the Mayflower itself to prove the so-called purity of their whiteness. This is just a small example of how weird racism and supremacy can get. Seeing how white folk did not want biracial folk and now consider them black, the unity between blacks and biracials only grew over the decades. This was a growth in numbers as well as a growth in resistance. However, things were not all rosy and unified as people like to remember. There was still much resentment on the part of biracials against monoracial black people for having been forced to associate with black people despite technically not being the same in their eyes and still believing themselves to be superior to actual black people. Many biracials still did not consider themselves to be black despite not being white, but considering that biracials were still a minority, it was safer to simply not antagonize the blacks that they were legally classified with. However, it also seemed to please some biracial or ambiguous black folk to be classed with unambiguous black folk because it gave them a sense of pride knowing that they were superior or the better type of black people. Today, a point of defense for the Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign is her roots in black culture by referring to the fact that she attended an HBCU, or historically black college or university. But this leads us to the second most damning practice of colorism by biracial or ambiguous black Americans, which people also tend to forget about: the brown paper bag test.
Girls are mad because they couldn't pass the brown paper bag test. Yep, I said it.
Churches, fraternities, sororities, in fact mostly sororities, special neighborhood or community events, social clubs, nightclubs, and even preferences in the admission process for these HBCUs would compare the complexion of those wanting to join or attend these events to a brown paper bag. If you were lighter than this brown paper bag, you were in. If you were darker, you were out. So claiming that Kamala attended an HBCU or is part of a so-called black sorority as a defense for her sudden desperation to identify as a black American isn't exactly the flex that one may think it is. It would actually be expected that a mixed-race person like Kamala be in such sororities considering their extremely colorist past. How were the biracial and lighter-skinned blacks able to control most of these institutions in most cases? It was because of the accumulation of wealth, property, ownership, connections to high society, and opportunities that I mentioned earlier that went as far back as the antebellum period, bestowed upon them from their slave owner fathers. Due to these advantages, the wealth and opportunity gap continued to exist between blacks and biracials in favor of biracials and high yellow blacks. Of course, there were slave owners who abandoned their biracial children and even denied being their parents, but it's less often mentioned how many slave owners did take care of their biracial children, just as it's less often mentioned how many of these children benefited from their slave owner lineage. So now in Jim Crow, these light-skinned, multiracial members of society were often referred to as the Blue Vein Society. This was in reference to the idea that if one was light-skinned enough to see one's blue veins under one's skin, they were considered high class and in close enough proximity to white society. At this point during Jim Crow, if you had such high yellow skin, it didn't matter whether your ancestors were European, Native American, or anything else. It was just a matter of colorism. But what made this worse than anything else was the fact that these same light skins discriminating against dark skins were all expected to be considered black and part of the same group of brothers and sisters in the struggle together, quote unquote. Unlike monoracial Europeans or monoracial Africans or Asians or anything else, biracial people often in society have the luxury of opting in and out of various situations as it suits them and when convenient, such as by escaping some persecution or dominating over others. Various anecdotes of dark-skinned individuals explain how, when in the company of whites or Asians who are behaving in a racist manner against the dark-skinned individual, light-skinned black individuals both try to make themselves appear just like the whites by joining in on the racism, or try to escape receiving the same treatment by making it clear to the racist that they are not the same as the dark-skinned blacks. Historically and globally, this has been a tendency among people of mixed heritage to side with those they stand the most to benefit from. Often biracial blacks shy away from the criticism of the behavior of those among them who are colorist, as well as racist in fact, against unambiguous black people in the very same manner that white people shy away from the racist ones among their own community. Just as many white individuals would prefer that everyone simply forgets about the horrific history of the white-led racism and white supremacy against various groups, and that everyone should simply get along and leave the past where it is. While first and foremost, racism and white supremacy are not, in fact, in the past, they are still very much alive and raging among white people. And it is that fact that appears to make such whites uncomfortable, as they know full well that people learning about these things reveals beliefs and prejudices and ideas that they or others in their community currently in this day and age still hold. The ones who do not hold such ideas will not have a problem in learning such history. Secondly, history should never be forgotten, as it is only by knowing and learning of history that we can understand how we arrived at the present, and this can assist us in solving problems, and not repeating mistakes in history. Now everything I've just described regarding white people applies perfectly with biracial American black people. They are often dismissive of the realities, experiences, and pasts of fully black Americans, just as many whites are. Many of them also still believe themselves to be superior to monoracial blacks, and rather than making the excuse that they have black friends, they simply say that they are black, and so somehow that makes it okay, just like many whites do. And when frustrated or upset, will let their racism and or colorism slip by insulting a dark-skinned person's skin or features as compared to their own, revealing what they had been thinking all along, just as many white people do. The difference, however, with white Americans and biracial Americans who get accepted into black communities is that while the forms of racism and supremacy are widely well understood and well documented with little to no controversy regarding the facts of how this racism persists from white folk, such as white parents and communities instilling their children with a belief that they are superior to others and that others are inferior, people are, however, far more squeamish to criticize biracial black people because largely Americans still mentally believe and apply the one-drop rule whenever convenient. They just often simply do not say it out loud. Because there is no biracial community to criticize or scrutinize, even scrutinizing or criticizing an octoroon who has as much to do with a black person that conservatives have to do with common sense is seen as punching down to a black person. And interestingly, despite everything I've just explained, most of the protection and acceptance for biracials comes from monoracial black Americans. Therefore, it is very much important to understand why and what parts do monoracial black people play in this entire matter. As with most things, there are those who did not contribute or participate in the discrimination of people, and the same went with biracials who were against the discrimination of unambiguous or dark-skinned black people. However, this sort of discrimination was not as openly perceived among the black community as the discrimination from whites against blacks for several reasons. One being that whites had law enforcement on their side while biracials didn't, and also because there was further division between poor light-skins and wealthier light-skins, and often the poor would side with the unambiguous blacks, which gave the impression that there was no discrimination from light-skins at all, because there were some biracials who stood in solidarity with monoracials. Now, many monoracial blacks who witnessed or suffered this discrimination from light-skins carried that rage of not only being oppressed by whites, but also from others in the so-called black community, and knowing that the latter oppression was less often spoken of or acknowledged, and this rage and resentment was passed on to their children, just as ideas of superiority among light-skins were passed on to their children.
I heard one of my friend's mother say, "Yes, honey, you're here to breed correctly." And of course, all these young, light-skinned gentlemen going to be doctors and lawyers, and I'm like, I'm not a horse. You know, like, I don't want to breed that way. You know, that brother right here, he's attractive. You know, like, I really don't care. Color issue is not a deal.
This resentment has led to numerous anecdotes from both biracial and monoracial black Americans all over regarding this issue, such as unambiguous blacks being excluded from positions or opportunities despite being more qualified than their ambiguous counterparts, to ambiguous blacks getting physically attacked or brutalized by groups of unambiguous blacks. These things still very much happen today, but mentioning a person's complexion in a story nowadays seems to be such a taboo or trigger point for many, for reasons I will detail in a moment. Ultimately, throughout Jim Crow, the oppression from whites began to overpower the in-group oppression from lightskins, compelling the entire black community, ambiguous and unambiguous, to unite against that oppression more tightly, because it became quite clear that no matter how yellow you are or how much money you have, one could never truly escape the hatred from white folk who had the means, the numbers, and the political positions to lynch and murder you just the same as the other blacks. This unity and struggle for civil rights caused many black folk to forget about the discrimination and prejudice from lightskins, as civil rights were of greater importance. But this simply meant that the issue was never fully confronted or addressed. To this day, this conflict between monoracials and biracials persists, but the response from many among black Americans is to downplay, dismiss, deny, avoid, or put a band-aid on the entire matter and say, let's forgive and forget and move on, despite the issue still being very much alive. Again, this is the same dismissive attitude many whites have when confronting white-led racism and supremacy till this day. Institutional and social racism is still very much alive. So here are some points of discourse, particularly from those who either don't wish to address the matter, or those who adamantly insist that black folk and biracial folk with black ancestry or parents should still be considered racially homogeneous, or considered to be part of the same racial classification. Basically, advocates for the one-drop rule. First point, what exactly will qualify or disqualify a person from being racially black? What metric will be used for this, considering that there is much European admixture in the black American population? Secondly, many biracial blacks have grown up mostly influenced in the community of their black side, know little to nothing about their white side, nor have anything to do with it. What is to happen to them? Thirdly, why should biracials have to identify as biracials if at least some non-black people consider them black? Fourthly, many black Americans wish to avoid further division than there already exists among them in terms of fighting for actual change in their community as a minority. Alienating any parts of their own will only weaken their cause in terms of numbers. Fifthly, why can't people just identify as whatever they want? Since race is a social construct anyway, why is it a problem to identify as whatever one wants? Sixthly, why should any of this matter in the first place? Why is such a conversation important? Again, the concept of race should never have existed in the first place, and should not persist in our time either. But because some societies, such as the US, are so heavily racialized, primarily by authorities and then by members of society, it becomes important to study and understand how it is utilized and weaponized in order to fight against different forms of racial discrimination. And it is in fact because of the inconsistency of the concept of race that opinions may vary on the matter on these points. But with regard to what metrics should be used, it will make sense to use the same metric that is so strictly used by other groups to level the playing field. Generally, people do not care so much about one's ancestry unless it clearly shows in one way or another in their phenotypic appearance. However, and this is important, Americans tend to live in a very American bubble and are not aware of the vast diversity in the sub-Saharan African genome. You find Africans with pointy noses, Africans with naturally wavy hair or hair of different natural colors, Africans with slanted eyes, indigenous Africans, especially in southern Africa, with naturally caramel skin complexions. These features are without admixture from non-sub-Saharan African ethnicities. And this all makes sense considering that the indigenous peoples of the African continent have the largest genetic diversity in the world due to having been on the continent for longer than peoples on other continents. Because remember that it is from Africa that the human race has evolved. Therefore, seeing a person with a certain facial structure or hair texture or light complexion or whatever features does not automatically mean that they are mixed with any other ethnicity. The clearest division, therefore, is between people who have an ancestor of another ethnicity, or so-called race, which shouldn't exist, from which we can generally and openly observe the admixture from their appearance. In our day, this is generally how other groups gatekeep their racial identity, even though there should be no gatekeeping of anything to do with race, because race should not exist. But for as long as other groups persist in keeping up the notion of race, Black people should work within the same framework to avoid being taken advantage of or misrepresented as a group. Points 2 and 3 can be summarized with this. A person can be part of any community they wish as long as they are accepted, but it does not change their racial classification in a racialized society. In fact, many of the proudest people to be Black and contributing to causes for Black people are actually mixed, just as many white folk have and are also ardent advocates for causes of Black people. There are even cases of white people being raised by indigenous African communities and speak only indigenous African languages and no European languages whatsoever. Such people are certainly considered 100% parts of the community and culture, as this is all they've known. However, if they are to enter a racialized predominantly white society, there will likely be privileges or a perception that the child will receive as opposed to if he or she were Black with the same upbringing. This is similar with mixed-race people in a racialized society who grew up with Black people. The prejudice against Blacks never disappeared among racists. It simply appears that there is progress because if given the choice, racists may choose a mixed-race person over a Black person due to their proximity to whiteness, provided that they have some white ancestry. Of course, this varies from case to case. There are many white supremacists who will not even accept mixed-race people due to their bizarre ideas of racial purity. Different African countries certainly have mixed-race people, but they still identify as mixed despite being part of that nationality, because that's what they are. But the unity and solidarity they have is based on their common nationality rather than race, or if you wish, their tribe or language or ethnicity, as we discussed earlier. This is why trying to form a community based on a nonsensical, inconsistent notion like race becomes very complicated, because that would in fact even mix together people who do not speak the same language. A Brazilian, an American, and an Ethiopian may all be considered Black, but may not be able to even communicate or socialize due to language and cultural barriers. Now in the United States, since mixed-race people are considered Black, normally this should not pose a problem if they are parts of the same community. But if one side does not fully see themselves as parts of the group, and even worse, begins to discriminate against other members of the group based on the very aspect that is intended to classify them as together, then clearly this Black community is divided. Now, of course, there is the matter that there are mixed-race Black Americans who have always and intend to always identify as fully Black for the rest of their lives and are completely ingrained in the culture. This does not change the fact that they are mixed, but it does not mean that they are not a part of that community. It just means that just like how some Hispanic people consider themselves to be a part of the white community without changing the fact that they are Hispanic, there are mixed-race people who are part of the Black community. But this should imply that the same skepticism that is directed towards white folk, in the sense of vetting them to ensure that they do not hold racist beliefs or fraternize with Black people only to turn and say racist things against Blacks when their backs are turned behind closed doors, should be applied to mixed-race people as well. The reality is that many Black people agree that the real problem is the code switching that happens among mixed-race people when convenient, just as with Latinos and other groups who try to form a so-called people of color unity alongside Black people. It has led to much betrayal and opportunism when occasions present themselves. No one is of course exempt from being able to betray the cause of people like themselves, but unlike people in the same group, mixed-race people have the luxury of being able to do this on the basis of not fundamentally being part of that group in the first place. But when it's time to return to black people for whatever reason, such as being rejected elsewhere or needing their votes or support, then suddenly they've always been part of the group and never went anywhere. Pygmies and Uncle Toms who are black may work against their own group, but they can never escape the black identity as mixed race people can. In other words, in America, mixed race people can hop in and out of being mixed and black whenever convenient. This sort of betrayal is easily observable among Latinos due to the clear distinction that exists between themselves and blacks, but because mixed-race blacks and monoracial blacks are to be considered the same group in America, this is less often openly criticized, and whoever does criticize them is accused of stirring up division among the group that is in desperate need of solidarity and unity, which leads us to the next point, the point on numbers. Indeed, numbers do play a significant role in a cause or struggle. If you have two distinct groups, they will of course advocate for their own respective communities first and more zealously than other groups. This is the same reasoning behind the intersectionalism in the collective identity that people in Western countries refer to as people of color, quote unquote. This is commonly intended to refer to people of racial classifications that are not racially classified as white. However, as many people may have realized, this very broad and diverse collective identity has its problems as well, because due to the different groups that form this collective identity having varying levels of average income and social privilege and societal perceptions, stereotypes, and experiencing different types of discrimination, it results in the entire group claiming to experience oppression, but in reality certain groups have it better while other groups have it worse in their lived experiences and the treatment they receive even from each other. Poverty among Asian Americans in the US is incredibly low, while it is significantly high among Black Americans, and yet when people use the term people of color, they could be referring to either one of those two groups or literally anyone who identifies as a so-called person of color. While the idea and possibly the intentions may sound helpful or beneficial in theory, the results come out as unbalanced and may even lead to further marginalization. For example, on May 20th, 2021, the Biden-Harris administration passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which would, as I quote, facilitate the expedited review of COVID-19 hate crimes and for other purposes, end quote. This of course only makes sense considering that Kamala Harris grew up surrounded by Asian kinfolk and community. She herself by ancestry being primarily Southeast Asian by ethnicity. Her priority is naturally toward her community, and so this act came as a response to a surge in attacks on Asian Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic. It is, however, very interesting to note that this act was passed in less than 1 full month, passing the US Senate on April 22nd, passing the House of Representatives on May 18th, and Biden himself signing it on May 20th, 2021. This is very interesting when considered in comparison to the Justice and Policing Act, or the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021, which is a very comprehensive and, in my opinion, well-written act that would, among many other things, prohibit federal, state, and local law enforcement from racial, religious, and discriminatory profiling, and require law enforcement to collect data on all investigatory activities, which is incredibly shocking that it is not already a requirement by law. But anyway, this act was proposed and introduced on February 24, 2021, before the COVID-19 hate crime bill, and completely collapsed in negotiations at the Senate level 7 full months later in September. Despite all the processes and negotiations, it only managed to pass the House of Representatives. Do bear in mind that both Democrats and Republicans voted against this bill, and also bear in mind that the House of Representatives as well as the Senate were mostly controlled by Democrats at the time. A link to the details of this bill will be in the description of this video. A bill which would indeed greatly help all so-called American people of color regarding law enforcement and justices, but especially Black Americans. Maybe it was because it would help so many Black Americans that it was rejected. Remember that politicians have more to gain financially from appealing and helping Asian Americans, considering that they have the highest average salary in the United States, even surpassing white Americans. Republicans were obviously against the bill due to it legally requiring law enforcement to deal with people within the confines of the law and as human beings. But interestingly, many Democrats opposed the bill too, despite the Senate being controlled by the Democrats, which is to be expected as both Democrats and Republicans have a vested interest in upholding the status quo, especially with regards to race in America. Because consider that no matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, most Americans are white, and so protecting that privilege is of utmost importance to the American government in terms of internal affairs. This has literally been the case since the inception of both parties. Since both parties are predominantly white, their privileges and benefits as whites would be challenged if more rights are given to other people of different groups. And so treating and considering people completely equal under the law is perfectly possible. It is simply being prevented. Bills such as the Justice in Policing Act could have prevented atrocities such as the murder of Illinois woman Sonia Massey. May she and others who have suffered the same injustice rest in peace. All this to demonstrate that when there is a system of classification that is as ill-defined, predatory, and exploitative as the concept of race, there will not only be problems when trying to apply such a classification system, but an even greater problem when applying it so liberally and unstably for some, while very conservatively and strictly for others. Within the ill-defined group, the situation may appear well for the entire group, when in reality one portion of the same group are disproportionately benefiting or suffering compared to the other within the group. It becomes difficult and sometimes even impossible to document or even record information of these disparities between black people and multiracial people because many multiracials identify themselves as black. Therefore, realizing this reality and no longer considering mixed-race people as black simply addresses the existing problems among black Americans rather than pretending that they do not exist. Pretending like they do not exist is just as when people who claim to be colorblind claim that the discussions regarding racial problems should not be discussed or that affirmative action should be dissolved, completely ignoring the fact and reality that black Americans in particular are systematically at a disadvantage not only due to historical injustices but present systemic discrimination such as the underfunding or even refusal to fund predominantly black learning institutions and rather overfunding or exclusively funding predominantly white learning institutions. Reluctance or refusal to discuss such injustices is nothing more than willful ignorance and fragility in the face of dealing with actual issues, and often is an attempt to perpetuate these injustices and keep the public, and especially the victims, quiet about it. Lastly, again and very importantly, I must stress the reminder that race itself is inherently and necessarily an oppressive concept in itself, and should be rejected and abolished by the public. Among individuals there are different appearances, but all are human. For as long as racialized societies exist, and especially as long as there are disparities in the average income, opportunities, and livelihoods of different groups of individuals, then discussions about these different groups should be openly discussed. Mixed-race people and the fact that they are mixed and not automatically or fully black should openly be discussed. But the greater and more important discussion should be on the concept of race itself and how people should stand against the concept, with actions such as refusing to state one's so-called race when asked for irrelevant reasons. However, there seems to be a strong desire among some unambiguous black Americans to consider mixed or racially ambiguous Americans as black to somehow have some proximity to whiteness and not isolate themselves further. Because if mixed-race people who are partially black are classified as their own group, it will only result in yet another group being closer to whiteness than they are, aka a better position in society, and therefore black people will appear even lower down the social hierarchy than they already do. This would be a return to the state of affairs before the one-drop rule, when mixed-race people were openly racist and distinct from black people. However, it only renders social divisions worse by upholding this concept of race by playing the game in the sense of trying to draw near to whiteness rather than trying to eliminate the concept of whiteness and the racial hierarchy in the first place altogether. And so, the bottom line is this. It is worth noting, however, that it is usually the more desperate monoracial black Americans who usually try to force biracial people into identifying as black. This is the same with the white-led media playing around with the black identity for their own convenience. But this is only happening due to monoracial black Americans not well defining or preserving their identity as a group. There should be unity between blacks and mixed-race people, but not due to race. Rather due to a movement to eliminate race as a concept and seek to fix problems in their communities as individuals. If they are to identify as the same group, however, then it should be consistent that black people should not be used as a crutch or stepping stone to reach one's goals only to no longer identify with the group when one obtains success. For each case in which this occurs results in more and more resentment, distrust, and conflict between blacks and multiracials, which is unfortunate, considering that there is an opportunity for unity for the purpose of positive change for the disadvantaged, not just between blacks and multiracials, but between all people who are classified into racial groups, in other words, all people all over the world. Once again, it is important to remember that the ultimate goal, hopefully, should be the betterment of the lives of people in society, regardless of who they are, to live a dignified life and be considered equal under the law and by people. This can absolutely be achieved, but an absolutely necessary step in this endeavor is to reject the concept of race and unite societies as members of the working class, regardless of their backgrounds, to construct better systems to live under, whereby the needs of the people are prioritized, regardless of who they are. I'm G.A. Sola. Goodbye.
See, it's a strange thing. I have been everything from light to dark, and it really depends on who you're sitting next to. If I'm sitting next to this gentleman, I become lighter. If I'm sitting next to someone that's lighter than I become darker, and because I'm kind of in the middle. That's why it's all really crazy, because it just depends on how you see it.
But it's important enough for you to do a lot of work on this and to co-author the book.
Well, because I think it's caused people a lot of pain.